The Resident Evil games are known for a few things. They're more action sci-fi horror than their contemporary competitors, such as the psychological horror-focused Silent Hill, the slasher-focused Clock Tower, the cosmic horror of Alone in the Dark, or the experimental role-playing horror of Parasite Eve. Developers of Resident Evil wanted to make sure that the horrors were on screen, clearly visible. While sometimes enemies may linger off camera, they're not hiding in the dark like creatures from the Amnesia games. The bioorganic weapons, known as the Tyrants, are large, imposing figures that stalk the heroes. The protagonists have action movie quips and don't look at explosions. The villains have monologues about the next step in human evolution and complete global saturation. The first three Resident Evil games are survival horror games, set during a small zombie outbreak in and around the fictional Raccoon City. In the first game, you play as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, two members of Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS. The setting is mostly confined to the Spencer Mansion in the woods outside of Raccoon City, as well as the secret Umbrella Corporation laboratory beneath the mansion. The second and third Resident Evil games expand the scope of the setting, letting veteran Jill Valentine and newcomers Leon Kennedy, rookie cop, and Claire Redfield, Chris's sister, run around confined areas of the city. And also, another secret Umbrella laboratory beneath the city, even bigger than the first one. The first two Resident Evil live-action movies loosely follow plots of the first three games, in that the first one takes place in a mansion and a laboratory, and the second one takes place in Raccoon City. Also, Jill Valentine is there. Mila Jovovich plays a new character exclusive to the movies, Alice. Alice's introduction in the movie vaguely has an Alice in Wonderland theme that gets mostly dropped shortly in. At the beginning of her story, Alice has retrograde amnesia, which was the style at the time. An Umbrella strike team finds Alice and drags her aboard a train to the Umbrella laboratory I talked about earlier. Once the train is in motion, they find another person, Alice's fake husband, who is also apparently suffering from retrograde amnesia, which was the style at the time. The gang makes their way to an underground wonderland, which is in this case the secret Umbrella laboratory under the control of an artificial intelligence called the Red Queen. After they enter the Umbrella lab, the first Resident Evil movie becomes a fairly straightforward horror sci-fi film, the same kind that writer and director Paul W.S. Anderson is known for. After the events of the first film, the sequel, Resident Evil Apocalypse, expands the scope. Instead of the confines of the Umbrella lab, there's a whole city for Anderson's characters to play around in. As an Event Horizon enjoyer, I can see a lot of the same DNA in the first two Resident Evil films. Anderson clearly likes action that is exaggerated, close-ups on his actors' faces, wide shots of endless hallways, and chunky sci-fi visuals. I can really see why you would choose Anderson as a director for a Resident Evil film. The horrors are all there on screen, clearly visible. The enemies are large and imposing figures that stalk the heroes. The protagonists have action movie quips and don't look at explosions. The villains have monologues about the next step in human evolution. So why don't the first two Resident Evil movies work, where the first three Resident Evil games do? How did the director who made one of my favorite sci-fi horror movies, Event Horizon, make a whole series of films that are just fine at best? I'm going to be focusing on Resident Evil 2002 and Resident Evil Apocalypse for this video essay, because the films starting around Resident Evil Extinction kind of become their own continuity. If this video does well, I might do one on the rest of the series. I'll try to keep most of the information from the games focused on the first three Resident Evil games and their remakes. I'm not going to be talking about Code Veronica, as I've never played it. Sorry, Code Veronica fans. The original Resident Evil is a game very much defined by its limitations. Capcom couldn't call it by its Japanese name, Biohazard, as there already existed a game called Biohazard in America that held the copyright, so they called it Resident Evil. In his video essay, A Thorough Look at Resident Evil, Noah Caldwell-Gervais points out that this naming limitation may have worked in Capcom's favor. Yes, I got sucked into Noah Caldwell-Gervais' 7.5-hour video essay. Biohazard may be more descriptive of the series and its narrative concepts, but it's boring, generic. Resident Evil doesn't really mean anything, but people who are trying to figure out what it means have already started putting at least some thought into it, more than they ever might put into a title called Biohazard. The developers designed its signature fixed camera angle style as a kind of compromise with the technology. The models for the characters and monsters are dynamic, but the environments are static images, essentially a slideshow. By mixing the two art styles, the game is able to look high definition, even when it's not. In his video, Was It Good? Dino Crisis 1, Josh Strife Hayes, Just Drive Plays, compares the technical competency of Dino Crisis and Resident Evil. Dino Crisis has fully rendered environments. The characters are standing in actual rooms with actual lights and actual moving objects. From a technical aspect, Dino Crisis is superior. But because the environments in Dino Crisis are real, they're not able to be as detailed or vibrant as the environments in Resident Evil. They're technically better, but they look worse. Finally, the combat. Combat in survival horror games is usually clunky. The movement in Resident Evil follows that trend. Characters are constricted by tank controls, able to move forward and backward or turn left and right, but not able to move and turn at the same time. In the original release, there is no auto-aim, something they added to the director's cut later that year. Combat in Resident Evil becomes something more of a puzzle than a fight. The player has to find a position in which they'll be relatively safe, sometimes having to run through a room of enemies only to turn around. Sometimes it's better to avoid combat altogether. Because of the fixed camera angles, enemies will sometimes lurk around corners, waiting for you to run by so they can grab you. Other times, you'll think you've cleared a room, only for one more enemy to approach you from behind, hidden by the camera. But because of this clunkiness, there's a joy in solving a room, and different players will come with different solutions to the same rooms, giving combat a sense of skill expression. Being able to solve a room without using ammo or without using healing means that you have more resources later in the game, giving you the ability to snowball in the late game. Your early successes echo throughout your playthrough. By the time you face off against the hulking tyrant at the end of the game, you either have to deal with your previous squandering of resources, or you get to pump the final boss full of magnum rounds. The core of the Resident Evil experience is built upon these limitations. Even though you play as a member of a big city elite special forces unit, you're never really safe. The tight corridors of the mansion, the shifting perspectives of the camera, the hampering of your movement, they all come together to create a sense of danger, while your overcoming of that danger creates a sense of accomplishment. Added onto that, the simplicity of the gameplay, the campy B-movie visuals, and the ambience all come together to form immaculate vibes. That core is expanded on in Resident Evil 2. Having developed their artistic style in Resident Evil 1, the Resident Evil team gets to show off in the sequel. The graying hallways of the Spencer Mansion make way for the improbably ornate hallways of the Raccoon City Police Department. The Umbrella Lab under the Spencer Mansion is scaled up to match the city it sits under. The enemies are more numerous, the danger larger and more present, the action more intense. The tyrant of Resident Evil 2, Mr. X, stalks Leon and Claire and is unstoppable, until the narrative allows it. The writing is better, Leon growing into a seasoned monster hunter over his campaign, Claire becoming a mother figure for Sherry Birkin. The game doesn't just have more action, more horror, it also has more depth as well. If you ignore the casual 90s sexism. We can also see the scope of the overarching story developing as well. Ada Wong, mentioned in the first game as a partner of an Umbrella scientist at the Spencer Mansion, is introduced as a kind of super spy, gesturing towards a bigger story, implying a kind of Bond or Licari-ish country-hopping narrative taking place behind the scenes. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is the final installment in the zombie trilogy of games, not counting Code Veronica. Sorry again, Code Veronica fans. Resident Evil 3 has historically been considered the weakest of the trilogy, with criticisms that it's too linear compared to the variety of approaches in the first two games, and too action-heavy to be considered scary. The tyrant of the game, Nemesis, is more aggressive, meaning that there's less time to focus on puzzles, which means that puzzles need to be simpler. Choices throughout the game are binary, and they pop up as text boxes instead of being diegetic to the environment. But the scope of RE3 is much larger than either of the first two. You have more access to the city, which becomes a giant maze because of blocked doors, crashed cars, makeshift barricades. There are more enemies than ever before, and more exploding barrels too. The game escalates right up to the conclusion, in which the city is destroyed by a nuclear blast. To quote Caldwell Gervais, it reaches a perfect peak of escalation here in the third game. The Resident Evil remakes, while they have been upgraded in various ways, look back to the originals they're based on. While RE1 Make could have recreated the original Spencer Mansion with a first-person perspective, the Resident Evil team instead decided to keep the limitations of movement and perception that the OG had. RE2 Make changes to an over-the-shoulder third-person shooter, similar to RE4, but is supported by the narrow corridors, deep shadows, and eerie atmosphere of RE2. And RE3 Make is still linear and more action-heavy than scary, but it aims to bridge the horror of the Virus trilogy with the action of the next trilogy, the Parasite trilogy of Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. Yes, I know that they go back to a virus for part of RE5 and 6, but the lost plug is parasites and the variants are the basis of the storyline, making them the foundation of the trilogy. Sorry. Remakes sits at the crossroads of the series' past. It's not quite an action horror game. It's not quite a horror action game. I'm about to talk frankly about my teenage years, so if you're sensitive to like father issues or abuse or anything, please feel free to skip to the timestamp on the screen. I promise I won't take it personally. My introduction to the series was actually Resident Evil 4. I was about 16, I was living in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky with my mom. My dad had kicked me out of his house because he mistook my being neurodivergent for being a trouble child, even though my grades were good, even though I never got in any kind of trouble. His anger issues and control issues just couldn't really let me or my girlfriend at the time be. So he chased me out of the house with a stun gun. I didn't really know anybody in Lawrenceburg, so I ended up just playing a lot of my girlfriend at the time's PlayStation 2. I picked up Resident Evil 4 Greatest Hits from my local Walmart and I played through it. I saw the horror elements, but for me it was clearly an action game, similar to Devil May Cry, which I didn't realize at the time was essentially a rough draft for RE4. Compared to a game like Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly, it barely even registered as a horror game. One of my friends and roommates after college was really into Resident Evil 5. He asked if I wanted to play with him, and we ran through the campaign over the course of the week. Him playing on his TV on one side of the room, me on my TV on the other side of the room. Kind of a 2010 version of couch co-op. Parallel couch co-op? I didn't have much interest in Resident Evil 6 when it came out, and I didn't have any reason to go back and revisit the original trilogy, so for me, Resident Evil was just those two games, Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, until about 2017. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is a horror game. It draws on the creeping dread of Hideo Kojima's PT. It beckons back to the deadites of The Evil Dead, Reagan and The Exorcist, the hillbilly horror of The Hills Have Eyes. It was a return to form for Capcom, built upon a history of horror media. The same core that Resident Evil had stumbled onto through its limitations, and Resident Evil 2 built upon to create an atmosphere of tense horror, was recreated in the beautiful and horrific RE engine. The shadows of the Baker residence are deep. The hallways are claustrophobic. You can almost smell the mildew, the rotting food, the droppings of cockroaches. You can practically feel the thick humidity of Louisiana swamps. Jack, RE7's answer to the tyrants, is horrifying. Rounding a corner to find him searching for you is terrifying. Each of the bosses has their own take on the horror formula. Jack is the traditional stalker, but he's updated for modern hardware. Marguerite Baker seems to control bugs that surround her, and when she transforms to fight the protagonist, you can see a bug nest on her stomach. She is metaphorically and literally the mother of the hive. Lucas has constructed an elaborate series of saw-like traps and puzzles for the player to work through. Late in the game, after fighting through Jack, Marguerite, and Lucas, the game shifts, becomes more action-oriented, lets some of the later Resident Evil games back in. The freighter and the mines are less scary than the first several hours of the game, but they are also mercifully short. A lot of people have already spoken or written about how the pacing grinds down at the end of RE7, so I don't really feel like I need to. But even despite its shortcomings, RE7 was enough to resurrect the franchise, the fan base, and the survival horror scene. Somewhere between the release of Resident Evil 7 and RE2 Make, I decided to play Resident Evil 1. I bought the HD remake on PlayStation, and I just ran through it as Jill in a few days. My roommate at the time didn't like horror, so I did it while she was gone on a long weekend. I replayed it again a few years later on PC after RE3 Make was released, running through RE1, RE2, and RE3 Makes, so I could, kind of, experience the original trilogy. While I didn't have nostalgia for the original games, I could feel the intention behind them. The fate of William Birkin and Mr. X, the final face-off against the Nemesis, the nuking of Raccoon City. Because of the solid foundation built by the early games, so much of the original trilogy, even reimagined 2 or 3 decades later, still works. If you've never seen the Paul W.S. Anderson live-action movies, you may not be surprised to hear that they do not work. Video game movies have historically been letdowns. The strange sci-fi dystopia of Super Mario Bros. 1993. Uwe Boll making adaptations of House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, Blood Rain, Postal, and Far Cry bad on purpose as part of a film insurance scheme. Allegedly. The strange takes on Double Dragon, Doom, Silent Hill, Hitman, Street Fighter, Prince of Persia, Warcraft, Uncharted, Borderlands, and Until Dawn. Paul W.S. Anderson's own surprising twist on Monster Hunter as an isekai with Marines for some reason. Not you, Mortal Kombat, you're fine. For some reason, directors have found it difficult to take the foundations set down by a video game and build a satisfying narrative around them. There are a bunch of reasons for this. Video games are experiences. When you play a game, there's a connection between you and the character on screen. You press the button or the analog stick and the character reacts. Light spoilers for Dark Souls and Sekiro. Skip to the timecode on screen if you want. For games like Dark Souls or Sekiro, the developers aim to try to form a responsive connection. As you learn the animations of a Dark Souls weapon or the parry timing of a Sekiro attack, the barrier between you and the character disappears. While fighting Sister Fried or Slave Knight Gale as the Ashen One, or Genichiro as the Wolf, you are experientially the hero, slaying the enemies, overcoming challenges, changing the world, and deciding the ultimate world state. Some games use that connection against you. Spoilers for Little Nightmares. Skip to the timecode on screen if you want. In the game Little Nightmares, you play as a girl named Six. At several points throughout the game, Six is shown to be hungry. The player, as Six, is fed by different characters throughout the game. Near the end, her stomach begins rumbling, and she doubles over in those familiar hunger pangs. One of the cute NPCs of the game, a gnome, approaches her. Throughout the game, the player as Six has helped the gnomes, and they have come to trust her. As the gnome approaches, offering her food to sate her hunger, the tone of the game shifts suddenly. Six lunges forward, gripping the gnome, and drains it of its life force. Streamers such as Markiplier and Jacksepticeye had similar reactions to the sudden twist. Why would Six do this? That experiential connection between the player and the character is broken suddenly as the player revolts at Six's actions. Why would she do this? The Resident Evil games are not as clever in their connections, or disconnections, between player and character. The characters are characters. Jill is Jill, Chris is Chris, Leon is Leon, Claire is Claire. The player is along for the ride and makes the decisions, but the player is never Jill, and Jill is never the player. This should be good for Paul W.S. Anderson. He can take the characters as they are. Chris isn't deeply characterized, but we know that he cares about Jill, that he's close with Claire, that he trusts Albert Wesker, probably too much, and that he leaves a coded message for his team that he's confident that they can decode. Chris is defined by his relationships. In the Japanese prequel novel, which I only know about because of Baffled Buffoon's video, Resident Evil's Secret Prequel and Why Nobody Talks About It, Chris is portrayed as someone who doesn't want to be part of the crowd, who wants to be a lone wolf. But the inciting incident of the novel is him responding to a friend's call, like some kind of good friend or something. Throughout the games, Jill is portrayed as a clever survivor who benefits from her connections, Barry in Resident Evil 1 and Carlos in Resident Evil 3, and Chris in Resident Evil 5, but I think that's just incidental. I don't think the writers of RE5 had any subtext in mind for any of the characters, at all. There is a horror in RE1 as the people that Chris and Jill have relationships with, fellow STARS members Kenneth, Forrest, and Enrico, are killed off one by one. You, as the player, may expect Albert Wesker's sudden but inevitable betrayal, but Chris does not. Chris and Jill are integrated into the world presented by the developers, even more so in the 2002 remake, where the graphical advances allow them to live in the world without any kind of visual seams. There is a verisimilitude created between the characters and the setting that the average player doesn't even notice. It is, for lack of a better word, cohesive. Contrast this with the first Resident Evil film. While Alice is the main character and the focal character, the film actually has a prologue that begins without her. We are introduced to Umbrella scientists working with a virus. As there is an accident that allows the virus to escape, the lab goes into a lockdown state. 2 scientists are trapped in a slowly flooding room. Many are trapped on an elevator that begins acting erratically. The film first presents itself as a kind of disaster movie, rather than a horror movie. The danger of the prologue is not the bioorganic weapons, the zombies, the virus, it's the lab itself. I understand why this prologue exists. It's meant to set the stage for 2 things. First, that the Umbrella Lab itself is a kind of character, a dangerous foe without a central body. We will be introduced to the Red Queen eventually, giving that amorphous foe a face. But secondly, it sets up that there's going to be an eventual twist that something or someone caused the outbreak of the virus that killed everyone in the hive. I think that this prologue works against the film. The audience is given too much information all at once. There's a lab, there's an outbreak, the lab is malevolent, there is something happening that you should keep in mind because it will come back around later. None of the characters in the prologue survive, plagued with survivor's remorse at being the sole survivor of the hive incident. Soon, Alice and the Umbrella Strike Team will return to the lab, where they will find everyone dead, or undead. Alice doesn't lose anything throughout the movie. She's not a member of a unit, she's not defined by her connections. She doesn't remember who she is, so she can be anything or anyone. While reading for the script, I found a review that said this feels like a self-insert fanfiction, and I definitely see where the reviewer is coming from. Alice is not integrated into the world. From her amnesia to her mutation in the second film, to her superpowers in the subsequent films, I don't want to talk about it. Alice is, in a phrase, overpowered. Alien is probably my favorite horror movie of all time. At the beginning of the film, the crew of the Nostromo wakes up and eats breakfast. They know each other. They talk to each other. They not only exist in the world of the film, they have existed in the world of the film. Ellen Ripley is a member of the crew of the Nostromo. John Carpenter's The Thing is another favorite of mine. J.R. McCready is a lone wolf, similar to how Chris wants to be seen in the prequel novel, but he is also part of the American Research Station. Alice is supposed to be the head of Umbrella Security at the Hive, and yet throughout the film that never seems to mean anything. I don't want to make it seem like central characters to horror films always have to be part of a crew. Another cult classic horror film I enjoy, Cube, takes a similar approach to the first Resident Evil film. The characters find themselves in an unfamiliar environment, a series of shifting cubes arranged in a giant formation. Some of the cubes are trapped. The characters, as they come to find each other in their exploration of the cubes, clearly come from different backgrounds and have natural distrust of each other. They are not part of a crew or a member of the same community. They are disparate and desperate, but they have pasts within the world of the film, and they have wants and expectations for the future. They are more real than Alice, despite being in similarly unfamiliar and dangerous situation. After the prologue has ended and the title cards have dropped, we get Alice's introduction. Alice awakes in a shower. Since the shower is not a typical place for a Mila Jovovich type to sleep, we can assume that something happened to her. Perhaps she has been knocked out. She looks at herself in the mirror but doesn't seem to recognize herself. She seems out of it and scared as she leaves the bathroom and enters the bedroom. On the bed, she finds a red dress and a note that says, "Today, all your dreams come true." Dramatic irony, as the viewer knows that those dreams will be nightmares. She goes to the dresser looking for clothes and flips through the drawers until she gets to one which has been converted into a high-tech weapons locker. As she's lost her memory, she reacts like someone finding an assault rifle in the drawer of their Airbnb. She wanders into the hallway, prepared to explore. She attempts to head outside, but before she can get too far, a cop grabs her and drags her back inside. A second later, the Umbrella strike team smashes through the windows and begin pointing their guns at Alice and the cop. One grabs her and tells her to report. Having lost her memory, she reacts like someone being asked to explain the plot of the last 4 Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evil films. The team unmask themselves, for some reason, and decide to bring Alice and her new cop friend along with them for their mission to the Hive. This honestly works better as the first scene of a B sci-fi horror action film than the Umbrella Lab prologue. Alice doesn't know what's going on, and so her surprise and the audience's surprise are both genuine. As Michelle Rodriguez and Colin Salmon bring her up to speed, the audience gets to learn along with her. While the retrograde amnesia does smell of early 2000s fanfiction writing cliches, it doesn't ruin the plot of the film. It's not egregious and could even be forgiven or forgotten as a way to bring the audience up to speed. Unlike Isekai Marine's Monster Hunter. Don't think I forgot about you. The pacing of Alice's introduction is closer to the pacing of the game, which introduces its zombie dogs roughly 2 minutes into the intro cutscene, and its first zombie only a few minutes later. It also matches the pacing of other zombie movies of the same era, like 2002's 28 Days Later, 2004's Dawn of the Dead remake, or even the OG, George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. The first zombie appears in the Resident Evil film roughly 27 minutes in, suspended in a tank, unable to harm Alice or her entourage, used only for an attempted jump scare as the zombie suddenly moves her hand to the glass between her and the viewer. Her eyes open, but they are noticeably dated CGI. If it weren't for the jump scare, you could make the case that Anderson is showing restraint with holding the zombies, trying to build the tension in a way that an Aliens or a Jaws might, but the directing actually works against that. The directing is frenetic. The camera bounces between characters. It slides between doors and objects, flashes images of stairwells and computer towers. Anderson wants you to feel a mounting tension, a sense of dread, but the camera work is preparing you for a Fast and the Furious action sequence. In 2010, Insidious director James Wan would perfect the atmosphere that it seems like Anderson was trying to build. The camera work in Insidious is slow and methodical, the horror quiet. The ghouls are not scary because they are rotting and otherworldly, but because they carry with them the sense that they are only waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The tension is not that they are monstrous, but that they are venomous snakes coiled at your feet, and if you make the wrong move, you could draw their attack. Anderson's zombies are the opposite. They are not symbolic, like George A. Romero zombies, a shuffling mass embodying systems of fear and oppression. Their closest analog might be the zombies from Zombieland. They are bullet fodder. They are a plot device. They are convenient contrivances used to get characters from point A to point B, and sometimes to titillate the audience by looking directly into the camera. So it doesn't work as horror, but does it work as action? I actually don't think it does, for a very important reason. Weight. In a film like Die Hard, director James McTiernan tries to situate Bruce Willis's John McClane in a world with weight to it. Even in an exaggerated action film like Predator, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Dutch experience a world that has weight to it. The guns that McClane and Dutch wield are heavy. The injuries they sustain make them slower, more vulnerable. When bodies fall, they smash, they crash, they make noise. Anderson's writing and Anderson's directing are at war with each other. He wants to make a sleek but scary sci-fi action horror film, one that builds tension and instills a sense of dread. About 40 minutes into the film, he introduces a ticking clock element. If the crew doesn't make it back in time, they might be locked into the lab by a security contingency plan, entombing them in the hive for good. This should be scary. It should be escalating stakes. When the Red Queen says, "You're all going to die down here," it should be intimidating. We, the audience, should feel scared for the characters. But because the film has that sleekness, because Milla Jovovich can jump around seemingly without the constraint of gravity, because the camera flashes the way it does and slides around, we get the sense that Anderson is playing with action figures for us. Nothing in the film has the weight it needs to be effective. Because Alice is in Wonderland, anything can, and usually does, happen. If Resident Evil 2002 was the only movie in the series, it might be remembered as kind of a silly but harmless take on the Resident Evil intellectual property. What if Resident Evil, but proto-Marvel? But the problems present in Resident Evil 2002 are amplified in Resident Evil Apocalypse. Alice is able to spin around in the air like a CGI doll. The film's version of Jill Valentine is able to shoot the handcuffs off a detainee. Alice is able to withstand curling up in a dumpster to survive an explosion. Carlos Oliveira can shake off a building collapsing around him. Resident Evil Apocalypse loosely adapts the plot of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Alice's cop friend from the first film, infected with a T-virus by a scratch from a tyrant liquor hybrid, I don't want to talk about it, is entered into the Nemesis program where he is transformed into a tyrant. This is not how the tyrants work in the game, but creative liberties, I guess. There are several plot threads here that are being woven together. Dr. Ashford, the architect behind the Hive, hires Carlos to retrieve his daughter from Raccoon City. The daughter is the model for the Red Queen from the first film, but she seems fine here. Honestly, turning your child into a malevolent artificial intelligence demon seems like an insult to your child more than anything. Jill and her sergeant meet up with a reporter who thinks breaking the Raccoon City story will make her famous. Mike Epps' LJ gets distracted by topless zombies and wrecks the car he was trying to escape the city in. Nemesis is hunting stars, but his primary target is Alice. Alice shows up to drive motorcycles, tell Jill she's too soft, and fistfight the Nemesis. A lot of people die, many of them for silly or bad reasons. I want to put forward a vision for what a Resident Evil film could be. This isn't me saying I can do it better than Paul W.S. Anderson. Films are made by huge teams of people, usually overworked and underpaid people, who are often constrained by producers and studios who have demands that might not fit in with their artistic vision. And so a film like Resident Evil or Resident Evil Apocalypse is bound to have writing or directing issues, even in the best of cases. And since I've never worked in Hollywood, I know I wouldn't be able to round up the funding or the people or the resources needed to make my own Resident Evil vision come to life. Think of this as my version of Ratat envisioning how to do the Dark Pictures anthology games better. My Resident Evil movie would start with a phone call. It would start with Chris in a Spartan studio apartment, a large bed but only him. On his side table, a picture of him and his sister, an older one of him and her and the rest of the family. On his dresser, a framed picture of him and his STARS Alpha team that he never bothered to hang up. He receives a phone call from his captain, Wesker. "It's 2 a.m, Wesker," Chris says, swinging his feet off the bed. "You're needed in the field," Wesker says. "Evil never sleeps." Somewhere else in the city, Jill is sitting at her desk poring over papers. She can't sleep. She has found a thread to pull at, something that's gnawing at the back of her mind. Her office is messy, books and files spread out over the desk and the floor. Coffee mugs from previous days, possibly weeks, are spread around. She too receives a phone call. "I'm calling an Alpha team," Wesker tells her. "I'll be there soon," she says. Alpha team gathers in a room in the Raccoon City Police Department. Bravo team was on a simple search mission over the Arklay Mountains when their chopper went down, Wesker explains. We don't know why the chopper went down. We don't know why we can't contact them on their radios. We have no idea how many of them are still alive. We need to be on high alert. In their respective locker rooms, Chris and Jill put on their uniforms, strap on their weapons. They are competent, focused people who take their job seriously. Their movements are practiced, the product of training and routine. They have done this before. This is their world. They board their helicopter, and Brad flies them over the Arklay Mountains, where Bravo team's helicopter went down. The team rappels down from the helicopter, making their way to the place where their colleagues disappeared. There, they find the smoldering wreckage of the helicopter. Any signs of life? Wesker asks. No readings, the unit calls one by one. Where did they all go? Chris asks. Where could they all go? Jill asks. In the darkness of the night, they hear gunfire, but when they run to discover the source, they find that a member of their team has disappeared, his rifle flung to the ground as though he was pulled into the trees. They search the branches with their lights, but don't see anything. No trace of their former colleague. Another victim in the night. Over the radio, a voice comes. I think I found something, one of their colleagues says. I'm lighting a flare at my location. A light shines out through the trees, and Chris and Jill make their way there, guns drawn. Against the tree, a body, lifeless, decaying. Look at the state of decay, Jill says. It must have been here for weeks. While they're focused on the body, they don't see a figure shuffling into light from behind them. Another decaying corpse. It almost looks alive, Chris says. From behind the one zombie, more step into the light from the darkness, a small horde quietly drawn to the light. The teammate who called them over turns around, sees the monsters approaching them, and goes to raise his gun, but it is too late. The monsters grab him with their impossibly strong hands, feasting on him. Chris and Jill gasp, raising their own guns and firing, destroying the heads of the zombies, but there are too many of them. They realize only seconds later that they are underprepared for the horror in front of them. They run, back towards Wesker and the others, but what they find back at the helicopter is a scene from a nightmare, as their teammates are being torn apart by decaying dogs and what appears to be slug monsters. Chris and Jill can't face the horrors, retreating, calling out on their radio for Wesker, Barry, Forrest, anybody, with no response. As the dogs and the leech monsters chase them, they stumble onto the grounds of the old Spencer mansion, rushing to throw themselves inside the gate, throwing it closed behind them. But as they do, they see that they are surrounded by the monsters who killed their teammates. Zombies, Cerberuses, those leech monsters. The only thing standing between them, a few inches of metal bars. They make their way into the mansion, finding Wesker in the foyer, seemingly injured. At the top of the stairs is a locked door, requiring 2 octagonal keys. We called on the radio, Jill tells him. I didn't hear anything, Wesker says. The radios may not be working out here. Maybe the mansion or the nearby mines or something are interfering with the waves. If that's true, then we're all alone out here, Jill realizes. What should we do? Chris asks, seeking a leader, seeking answers. Chris, you search the east side of the mansion. Jill, you search the west side of the mansion. See if you can find the keys to unlock that door at the top of the stairs. We'll regroup here in an hour. Are you going to make it that long? Jill asks. I'll be fine, Wesker says. The next approximate hour would play out as 2 journeys. A Chris plot in which he meets up with Rebecca, who would tell him about what happened with Bravo team and the events of Resident Evil 0. While exploring their side of the mansion, Chris and Rebecca would find rooms of enemies that they would need to fight through, as well as pieces of an Umbrella logo crest, a black array, a white array, and a red array. Chris would be characterized as a soldier, a weapon, always moving forward with his gun or his knife. Rebecca would be characterized as a healer, a combat medic, willing to use a gun, but more comfortable with stitching set. Between Chris sequences, Jill would meet up with Barry Burton. The two would experience similar sequences as Chris and Rebecca. Jill would be characterized as a clever survivor, using wits and reflexes to get out of traps or get around enemies rather than fighting them head-on. Barry would be harder to read, sometimes the concerned father figure trying to protect Jill, sometimes a fellow member of her elite unit, sometimes standoffish, as though he is waiting for her to slip up somehow. Is he friend or is he foe? Along the way, they would end up with 3 pieces of an Umbrella logo crest. The 4 characters would get hurt through their journeys. Chris would have scars. Jill would have bruises. Think Jurassic Park, or the previously mentioned Predator. Upon arriving back in the foyer, the 4 of them would find Wesker gone. Has something happened to him? Is he in danger? Let's see what's behind the door, Jill would say. They would insert their keys and make their way to the end of the hall to find an elevator with no keys. That elevator would take them to the secret Umbrella lab that would mark the transition to the final act of the film. The final act of the film would be plot-heavy. Wesker was secretly working with Umbrella. Barry was secretly working with Wesker. Wesker arranged this whole thing to see how the bioorganic weapons would fare against his elite unit, and the weapons performed flawlessly. But there was one more weapon he had yet to release. The Tyrant would be revealed, the ultimate bioorganic weapon. Wesker would make his exaunt, finishing with his business at the Spencer Mansion, ready to sell his data and pursue his next scheme, leaving the other four to die to the Tyrant. But rather than dying, the four of them would work together to find a way to stop the Tyrant. Rebecca would set the self-destruct sequence for the lab, Barry would radio Brad, arranging for the helicopter to pick them up, and Chris and Jill would slay the beast. Until the helicopter arrived, they would have to finish it off in the classic Resident Evil fashion, with a rocket launcher. As the four boarded the helicopter and Brad began flying, the final triumphant scores would start to play, until Jill noticed that they were flying in the wrong direction. She would take a pair of headphones from the wall and click the radio button. "Hey Brad," she would say, "you're flying in the wrong direction. Raccoon City's back that way." "You don't want to go that way," Brad would say. "Where it is, it's being overrun with monsters." "Monsters?" Jill would ask, her face reflecting the horror of realization. The triumphant music would start to turn more dissonant. What should be their moment of glory is only the beginning. From his seat opposite her on the chopper, Chris would wordlessly realize himself that it wasn't over, and the credits would roll.